Now for today's program. Jennifer Rubin writes reported opinion for The Washington Post, covering politics and policy, foreign and domestic, and provides insight into the conservative movement, the Republican and Democratic parties, and threats to Western democracies. Jennifer is also an MSNBC contributor and has worked at Commentary Magazine. Prior to her career in journalism, she practiced labor law for 2 decades, an experience that informs and enriches her work. Jennifer is the author of Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Joining Jennifer today is Robert Siegel. Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. In 2018, he was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism. He has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rubin Medical Center on the JBS, Jewish Broadcasting Service television network. Robert is a special literary contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Jennifer Rubin and Robert Siegel.
Donald Trump, you're interested in in women in politics. So this is a historic day in that department. Nancy Pelosi announced that while she'll remain in Congress, she won't seek the speakership once again or a position in leadership. What are your thoughts about Pelosi's term as leader of the House Democrats?
Well, I think she is, by any account, one of the most consequential, one of the most effective speakers in modern American history. The comparison that people make is to Sam Rayburn. But of course, Sam Rayburn enjoyed huge majorities in the House in shepherding through legislation. Nancy Pelosi was sometimes in the minority. And when she was in the majority, often had very, very thin majorities. And yet, when you look back on her career, whether it was passage of the ACA and then defense of the ACA when it was endangered in Trump's first 2 years, whether it was really the slew of legislation that Biden got through, very consequential, despite kind of the perception that he was a weaker president than perhaps he really was. And of course, she saw the House and saw the country through 2 great calamities. 9/11 and then January 6th, in which I think we have really only begun to appreciate the moral leadership, the emotional stability that she offered during that horrible, horrible day. And when you look back on her career, how influential she was in human rights for China, and one of the very earliest proponents of the agenda to combat climate change. And of course, her groundbreaking role as a woman and a woman politician. With all due respect to the vice president, she is the most powerful woman politician in the history of America. She was 3rd in line to the president, or 2nd in line behind the president, and moreover, essentially ahead of an independent branch of government. And I think we are going to be studying her career, her management, her leadership style for years and years to come. And I don't think there is a woman in politics who does not owe, in some respect, her career and her advancement to Nancy Pelosi. And one of the things she did, and speaking to me for my book, one of the things I think she will be known for is advancing women in ways that really are very meaningful to people in the House. And having gone through that experience herself, she was very cognizant of the need for women to establish national security credentials. And she did that. And she, in fact, gave freshman women, almost unheard of, subcommittee chairs, which may not seem like a whole big deal to the average American, but actually in Congress is a really big deal. And that is preparing the next generation of women to lead, something that will have grave consequences. So she mentioned it today on the floor of the House, and it was really a very moving speech to her colleagues, to the country. You know, the gal who learned politics at her father's knee, Thomas Alessandro, who was the mayor of Baltimore, multi-term congressman, who as she said, never imagined she would go into electoral politics, raised a family, was a influential donor and party organizer in California. And then 47 years old, she first entered the Congress. And her rise and her career is really a monument. So you're absolutely right. Of all the things that have happened in the last week or so, I think closing one chapter, at least in her career and in the history of the House, has to rank at least in the top 5 things of all the impressive things that have happened.
Happened in the past 8 days or whatever. And the one thing I would add about Nancy Pelosi was that she didn't behave as though being the first woman Speaker of the House that gender had nothing to do with this. When she became Speaker, we broadcast the events that day from Capitol Hill. I remember it when I was at NPR. And that was the beginning of the session of Congress, where all the grandchildren and children were invited up to the podium. It was unlike any other beginning of Congress, and it was clearly it was her style. It was her. Yes. It was her doing it.
You know, it's such a great point. I'm going to have a piece this Sunday talking about her leadership style as a woman. She didn't have any role model, and she didn't try to be a man. She didn't dress in a dark suit. She's known for those resplendent colors. She is known for a very empathetic style of leadership. She was an unabashed supporter of women's reproductive rights. That was one of her main issues. She always spoke about the children, and these were, she was able to combine this steely discipline, this toughness, with a embrace of her femininity and a feminine style of leadership that proved to be very successful. There was not a member of Congress whose name and family she did not know, whose district she didn't know at least as well as they did. And when you looked at how she dealt with a House that was so diverse and perhaps more diverse earlier on, in terms of understanding everyone's issues and what they needed to make the vote, to give her the vote. It really is quite a testament to her management style. It's funny, a business person who will go unnamed once made the comment to me that he has never seen anyone as good as she was in their job. And I think in some respects, that's true.
Well, let's turn now to that other thing that happened last week, the midterms. My question for my journalistic friends this week after the midterms is, what's the lead? What if you had to summarize what happened on November 8th and after the votes were counted, what would you say of significance took place?
I think it was a remarkable repudiation, in spite of economic uncertainty, in spite of inflation, of a uncontrolled, authoritarian, scary, kooky style of politics that Donald Trump perfected. Now, he was not on the ballot, but in some sense, he very much was. And in selecting so many Republicans in the primaries, governors, senators, many who lost, he really did present this as the face of the Republican Party, as the style of leadership, as the embodiment of the new right and the Republican Party. And the public, I think to their great credit, said, you know, we don't really love Biden. We're very nervous about inflation, but this we do not want. And whether you call that a referendum on democracy, whether you call that a referendum on functional government, whether you call it a referendum on sanity, it was a signal that this has gone a bridge too far. And I think there are many reasons why that resonated, not the least of which was Liz Cheney coming out to endorse Democrats and to warn Republicans about voting for some of these characters. And of course, the January 6 hearings, which really made clear how close we came, how dangerous this style of leadership is. And I think what you saw up and down the ballot in governor races, attorney general races, secretaries of state races, House and Senate, you saw that where Republicans did well, it was those who rejected this sort of politics. I look to Georgia, for example, where the governor, Brian Kemp, who was adamant about certifying the results, and the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who, of course, withstood quite a bit of pressure, they were both reelected. So this was not a repudiation of conservative views in the old sense of conservative views. It was a repudiation of this denialism, of this crazy, chaotic style of politics.
Were you surprised by that, what you've just described?
I did not think it was going to be a huge red wave for an entirely different reason. And that is that once the Dobbs opinion came out, I had a gut feeling, and it was because I think of the book that I wrote, that there was going to be a tremendous pushback, a tremendous backlash, because abortion is not just one issue. It's a significant identifier for women of their personal freedom, of respect, of a kind of self-determination. And just as the election of Donald Trump was a shock to their system and led many women to organize and get involved in politics, I felt that the media, in many respects, underestimated the anger, the fear, the determination of women, that this was simply a bridge too far, and how many Republican women as well. You have seen the numbers on abortion shift rather dramatically, so that you have about 2/3 of the country very strongly in support of, if not abortion under all circumstances, abortion at least under most circumstances. And when you saw in Kansas this summer, a referendum in a deep red state, not just win by a little bit, but win overwhelmingly, I had the sense that something else was afoot. And one of the things I did in the late summer, early fall, was to interview a number of female Democrats in swing districts. And I will note, I don't think there's a cause and effect here, but every single one of them won. And why did they win? They were telling me two things. One, they were leaning into the abortion issue. They sensed that their opponents' extremism on the issue was not what voters wanted to hear, that this was, in some sense, got conflated or got combined with election denial to portray these people as extreme, crazy, irresponsible. And the other thing is that they finally had something to run on. Biden's legislative streak during the summer on everything from the Inflation Reduction Act to the PACT Act to the CHIPS Act to what was a small step, the first gun legislation in 30 years. All of these things finally gave them something positive to say, that, hey, we've done something. We're moving in the right direction. And there was, I think, a real change in their confidence level and in the tenor of that campaign during the summer. And the people I talked to, Susie Lee from Nevada, Angie Craig from Minnesota, Kim Schreier from Washington, they were in tough districts and they all won. And I also spoke to Catherine Cortez Masto, and she had a very, very tough race. She's
the Nevada senator, we should say, the incumbent.
Yes, but she too kind of combined these issues. Adam Laxalt, her opponent, had been a vociferous election denier, had brought all kinds of lawsuits, had tried to prevent the certification of the election. And he had taken a very staunch anti-abortion position. And those were the issues she really, really leaned into. And listen, she didn't win by a lot, but politics is at the margins. And I think that was the message that was successful for so many Democrats this time.
Let's turn to the other party. You've written about the need for Mitch McConnell and his fellow Republican senators to separate the party from Trump, I'm quoting, and return the GOP to the status of a normal political party. That line sent me remembering 2016, which was the last campaign I covered before retiring. And I remember being in New Hampshire and watching a Jeb Bush event. Bush was very charming, very pleasant. It was a very small room, so it was packed with people. But there was absolutely nothing compelling, no message that I can recall that he had to offer. It might as well have been a seance reaching out for Ronald Reagan. That was my personal image for what I was looking at, and it makes me wonder. A normal political party, minus Trump, what is normal republicanism at this stage?
That is not only a $64,000 question, that's the whole ball of wax. Because in point of fact, minus Donald Trump, the Republicans don't have much going for them at all. They don't have a compelling set of characters. They don't have a formula in the way Ronald Reagan brought a kind of a three-legged stool to the Republican Party: traditional values, strong on national security, limited government, and tax cuts. That whole nexus of issues has really, with the exception perhaps of tax cuts for the rich, have really kind of reached a dead end. And in fact, you saw that they're very much big government people under Donald Trump, running up the deficit in the spending that they've engaged in, and now in the ways in which they're willing to use the state to achieve cultural and their own partisan ends.
But I would just insert here also, on the other hand, using the government very creatively to get a vaccine out to the country, to get a couple of vaccines out to the country for COVID, an effort which they effectively renounced themselves. They won't take any credit for Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, this is this never, never world that they feel like they have to live in now. They have whipped their base into such a frenzy that I think in many respects they're trapped now. We're certainly going to see that in whatever primary fight they have. That they have, the problem with any addiction, any sort of, high that you get is the dose that you got yesterday is not enough to keep you going as time goes on. You have to turn up the heat, turn up the heat, turn up the heat. And so that's how they've gone from, sort of flamboyant and irreverent and kooky to really kind of crazed and dangerous. And that kind of network of right-wing media combined with Donald Trump and his followers has created a situation in which people who know perfectly well that a lot of this is nonsense, who know perfectly well that Joe Biden won the election, know perfectly well that COVID was real and that the various inoculations and treatments were life-saving, felt that they could not say it, felt that they had to play to the mob, to the crowd. And how they navigate that in the wake of a midterm election in which that proved so damaging in a general election context is going to be fascinating to watch. Now, in the past, politicians have always run to the sort of the extreme in a primary and then tacked back to the center. But this is kind of a horse of an entirely different color here. The question is whether they can continue to assert these policies and these positions and this tone that proved so deleterious to them during the midterms, if they can give that up without losing control of a critical faction of the primary electorate that they need to get the nomination. So it's going to be fascinating to see, and it's going to be fascinating to see how, Kevin McCarthy, who finally got his life's wish, he's going to be Speaker of the House, but he has the tiniest margin. And by the way, the number of people who die, get ill, indict,
Yeah.
or indicted, retire from Congress is much higher than I think the margin that he is going to have. So he may not be speaker for very long, quite frankly. It is not inconceivable that it might go back and forth a couple times. But in any case, he is now hostage to this, the Freedom Caucus, the Marjorie Taylor Greens. And what did they announce after trying to make this whole midterms about inflation? What is their big announcement today? The first order of business is Hunter Biden investigations.
Yeah.
And the Democrats cannot believe their good fortune. They are, delighted to have the Republicans make fools of themselves and go down a road that solves no one in America's real life problems, and demonstrates how irresponsible and dangerous in many respects, they still are.
Yeah, it's funny, McCarthy I think he became famous to many for saying that Hillary Clinton had very high ratings, and then they had the Benghazi hearings and they drove down her approval ratings. You can't drive down Joe Biden's approval ratings that far. This has all happened in the context of a president who has rather low approval ratings.
Exactly. And I think what we learned from this is that, the modern presidency is such in a very tribalistic politics that the days in which presidents enjoyed over 50% approval may be a thing of the past entirely, that we're going to live with presidents who are rather unpopular because half the public automatically hates them. And then, of course, no president is perfect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other party is going to be rewarded. Politics is a matter of choice. It is not a yes or no referendum. You have to say, are the other guys any better? And a woman who has made quite a name for himself is a good friend of mine, Sarah Longwell, who does these focus groups, said she could see this a mile away coming. She talked to focus groups in Arizona. And what were they concerned about? Inflation. Do they like Biden? No. And, who are they going to vote for senator? Well, what's the choice? Blake Masters? Oh, he's crazy. We're not going to vote for him. And that was the process, I think, that many, many voters were going through. And you don't have to be in love with one side. You just have to think, the other guy's worse. And
I always felt that was one lesson from going out and doing reporting on a political race is how many people decide their vote based on the reasoning that this one's not as bad as the other one. I mean, I think people ask, is this someone who'll look out for my interests, and who's the other guy? Forget about it. I'll vote for this one. And which is not the way people who cover politics think.
Absolutely. And I think we get ourselves deluded by looking at the way people answer poll questions. And that is really very different from how they ultimately vote, because they may say inflation is the top issue. They may say Biden is not their cup of tea. But when it comes to the election, it's a kind of gut level feeling. Do they feel comfortable with these people? Do they trust these people? And suddenly, they wind up in a very different direction than what they said were policy issues. But of course, voters are not pollsters, they're not pundits. And in many instances, it is not a policy position that drives them in favor of one party or the other.
You left the Republican Party in 2016, saying that the party had become warped by Trumpism. You became, I think, a charter member of the Never Trumpers. And I think, frankly, I think the most interesting people writing about politics for the past several years have been former Republicans trying to wrestle with this thing that's happened. Can you imagine there being a Republican Party that you could return to, having voted for Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden? And can you imagine something a little bit more Romney-ish or something more centrist? Or have you crossed the road and there's no turning back?
I think I've crossed the road, no turning back, on two levels. One, the people who have participated in this, I would never trust with power again. Whether they were silent appeasers of Donald Trump, whether they were active enablers, whether they are members of the administration, they failed in a fundamental, basic way to live up to their oaths and to defend democracy, which was, really in danger and has been in danger, and to some degree remains in danger. So as a personal matter, it's sort of like the Jews in the desert. They all have to die out before I will go back and trust them to be a free people. And the other is, I fear that for the foreseeable future, the Republican Party is not a conservative party. It has drifted the way of right-wing nationalist European parties in ways that are really personally an anathema to me. That they operate on anger, on resentment, on fear. They operate in a non-truthful, in a propagandistic space. They look to grievance, they look to demonization, and it is a very, very dangerous, I think, tendency. It's led to no good in European history, and although we have had flashes of it in American history, this is by far the most power they have ever aggregated. They had the presidency, for goodness sakes. And I think it remains a danger. And I think the authoritarian temptation, to borrow another phrase from another era, remains. And I think the challenge in the immediate and perhaps semi-long term, challenge in politics is going to be how people who are small d Democrats respond, address, negate a authoritarian nationalistic tendency that has now come to dominate the right. And that's going to be really a big order.
But what I'm hearing implicit in what you're saying is that there is you do retain some conservatism, what is that? What remains of your conservatism?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of conservatism, and this is not, I think, widely appreciated, is more temperamental than it is policy position. It's an appreciation for unintended consequences. It's a certain humility about governance. It's a preference for gradualism over giant leaps of policy. It's an appreciation for the so-called mediating, the civil institutions of society that play such an important role in our life. And those are the sorts of tendencies that conservative used to have that they have entirely abandoned. If you want reckless and overly ambitious, leap before you look kind of people, that's what dominates the Republican Party. And that is just what I intuitively, push back against. And in that sense, there's a difference between centrism and moderation, but I consider myself a moderate in the sense that less is often more. You don't have to be a squishy, split the baby in two, but there is a certain appreciation for and a certain respect that is owed for our government institutions, our fellow citizens, that should make us wary of these very dramatic, very ideologically driven movements. It is also true that from a policy standpoint, the Republican Party doesn't stand for many of the things that initially attracted me. I, in many sense, grew up in the height of the Cold War and take democracy and human rights very seriously. Are they going to be the party of Putin? Are they going to be the party of, Ronald Reagan? What direction? And right now it's kind of a giant mishmash of all of the above. Frankly, both parties have become protectionist, which I think is bad economics. And the Republican Party has become virulently anti-immigration, not only illegal immigration, but legal immigration. Yeah. And I have to say, people, Nancy Pelosi remembered this, but people forget how pro-immigration Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush were. Yeah. George W. Bush put forth and got through the Senate, at least, died in the House, a very, what we would call progressive, comprehensive immigration reform. They truly believe that the lifeblood of America is this ability to renew ourselves generation after generation, that it is part of the American formula, that we are not defined by nation, religion, race, but by a common ideal and a common aspiration. So these things that were once what attracted me to the conservative movement, I can't find anywhere in today's Republican Party. And, you know, frankly, I think you also learn to prioritize, as voters did. You may not be thrilled with everything one party is up to, but right now, democracy, protection for the rule of law, a certain civility in public life, an appreciation for objective reality. I'm old enough to remember when conservatives believed in objective reality. And those things right now are foremost in my mind when I look at politics.
The journalist Theodore White, who used to write The Making of the President every 4 years, he began in 1960. I remember hearing him once talk about how the midterm elections are when the cards are dealt. And 2 years later, the game is played out in the presidential race. The example he used, by the way, which was about his original book, in the beginning of 1958, he said it was clear that the best candidate for the Democratic Party with the greatest resume was the governor of New York, Averell Harriman, famous wartime diplomat. Unfortunately for Harriman, he lost the gubernatorial race in November to Nelson Rockefeller, the Republican, and a path was opened for John F. Kennedy. So this has been seen as the time when the next race begins, really. Who's holding the good hands? Who's holding the bad cards right now, do you think?
And by the way, that reminds me very much so of the Bush brothers, that if you remember, Jeb Bush lost to Lawton Childs, and he was supposed to be the guy that was
He was the Bush son who was supposed to run, right?
Exactly. And instead, his brother, George W. Bush, who had been sort of the black sheep of the family, had an impressive win in Texas, and then later went on to obviously a successful presidential run. So, you know, holding the cards right now, to, I think, the constant amazement of the press, which doesn't quite get Joe Biden. Joe Biden is holding a lot of the cards in the Democratic Party. If he wants to run, he's going to run. He's not going to get challenged. And at one level, you say, why wouldn't he run? He's just had a kind of miraculous survival that by historical standards is incredibly impressive. He got through a whole bunch of legislation in his first couple of years. He built this coalition and really expanded NATO, something we never thought was going to be in the offing. He's put the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. Why wouldn't he run? And you see, well, his ratings are at 42%. But again, as we have seen, the question is, who's the other guy? So I think he and those Democrats who are embracing a broad economic bread and butter kind of traditional Democratic message, which is looking out for the little guy, are in a pretty good position right now. Now, inflation and a possible recession is going to have a huge amount to say about where the parties stand relative to one another in 2024. On the Republican side, it's sort of a prisoner's dilemma, isn't it? On one hand, Donald Trump has them by the throat because he has a solid core of supporters, and in a multi-person race, a plurality, as he did in 2016, will win you the nomination. And if he loses, he may choose to blow up the entire party, telling his people to stay home, or even more dangerous for Republicans, running as a third party candidate. So they still have this fundamental question of what to do with Donald Trump and whether they embrace him, whether they can get rid of him, and then what follows. And many people have said, well, Ron DeSantis is the heir apparent. A lot of people said Jeb Bush, as you say, was the next in line. And you have to see how these people perform. To quote Lloyd Benson, I know Ron DeSantis. He's no Donald Trump. He is not a very charismatic guy.
Yeah.
He's
not an entertaining character to watch.
No, he is kind of a little plodding, a little bit kind of surly. And if entertainment value is now what sells in the Republican Party, it's not like he has it in, loads and in surplus. In some respect, Kerry Lake, who lost, was much more in the vein of Donald Trump, this kind of crazy entertainment media creation than Ron DeSantis. So we're going to have, I think, a number of people who are going to put their toe in the water. Everyone believes that there's a Mike Pompeo voter out there. There is a, Larry Hogan voter out there. We're going to find out whether there is or not. And they're going to have a real fraught primary system, I think. And, right now we're assuming that Joe Biden will run for president. What if he doesn't? Then I think we do not have a coronation of Kamala Harris. Then we also have a very hotly contested primary on the Democratic side. So, the great thing about elections is they remind you that you got to watch the movie to the end. You got to see how everything plays out. You can prognosticate, you can poll, you can pontificate, but you got to see how these people perform.
There's only one branch of government left for me to ask you about. So let me ask you to elaborate on something that you said a couple of years ago about the Supreme Court. For decades, you said, women and minorities have relied on the court as the ultimate backstop for protection of fundamental rights like voting and abortion. And now you have people on the court who are essentially partisan hacks enacting the policy objectives, the policy outcomes of the party of the president who nominated them. At what point would you say the hacks took over?
Well, they have a 6-3 majority. I think when it was a 5-4 conservative majority, and two of those were Justice Kennedy, who is a very moderating, somewhat unpredictable force, and Chief Justice Roberts, who is, I think it's fair to say, an institutionalist. There was a certain balance. It was a conservative court, but it was not adventuresome. It was not disrespectful of precedent. After all, Roe v. Wade lasted for 50 years and many years under a conservative court, that you didn't see them kind of unmoored from a judicial temperament and a judicial role until they achieved the 6-3 majority, in which case now Justice Roberts doesn't have control of the court. It's not his court anymore. Yeah. It's the Alito Thomas court. And we have seen just how radical it can be, just how dismissive of precedent it can be. And we've seen kind of almost an institutional hostility to due process substantive rights and also to voting rights. And whether it's Section 5, which the Chief Justice essentially took out of commission, or Section 2, which Justice Alito eviscerated. And some of these injunctions or not holding in injunctions that made the difference in a few critical House seats when we're talking about the difference between the parties. There has been a real hostility in many senses to a non-colorblind use of voting rights in the 14th Amendment. And one of the most fascinating debates that we've seen in the court for a very long time, it was this debate during the last kind of sessions of the Supreme Court, in which Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is saying, well, if you want to play originalism here, let's talk about the 14th Amendment. This was not a colorblind edict. This was clearly intended to correct the injustices of the South, to put the finger on the scale of African Americans, and to guarantee a set of rights that were necessary to achieve full citizenship. That's not the view of the 6-3 majority. And you see that play out in voting rights. You're going to see it play out in affirmative action. You're going to see it play out in a host of different ways. So it's, I think right now there's an imbalance, obviously. So they're fascinating arguments, although the outcome is rarely in doubt now. But I think, you know, the court prides itself on not being, you know, susceptible to politics until they're susceptible to politics. And just as the, you know, New Deal court was eventually kind of shunned into accepting the New Deal, it's going to be very interesting to see whether this Supreme Court, in light of the kind of repudiation of many of the rights policy outcomes, becomes a little bit more cautious, a little bit less willing to go whole hog in overthrowing precedent.
You know, thinking about the midterm elections again right now, one way of looking at them is that for yet another couple of years, the country, regardless of who controls what, is very deeply divided, and we haven't seen a real landslide. Well, maybe Obama came close to being Obama won. And I'm just wondering, we are quite divided, predictably. So we have both houses now, the smallest majorities you can imagine them having. And I try to think, what is it that essentially divides us? That is, what is at one time I thought that that pro-choice, pro-life was like being wets and dries, or pro-slave and pro-free or something. But it turns out, as we saw this year, that actually the country has worked out a kind of consensus on this deeply divisive issue, and felt you know, that the Supreme Court was wrong to have eliminated Roe v. Wade. What is it? When you think of what divides Americans, what is it? Is it race and region? Is it nationalism versus belief in immigration? What or just rural versus urban?
I think there is a very American answer to the question, and then there is a global answer. The global answer is, we see the same pattern in many Western democracies. We see it in European elections, in which it's people in rural areas who have more traditional values, who are more religious, who feel economically isolated and left behind, are pushing back against a multiracial, multi-ethnic, increasingly secular society, in which education and higher education are absolutely critical to personal and financial success. And this sort of butting heads of these two sides of the equation, it's happening in England, it's happening in France, Germany, and you see the emergence of right-wing parties. Look at the government that's come to power in Italy. Look at the right-wing government that has emerged in Germany. So there is an international component that speaks to the difficulty that democracies have had navigating this very unsettled economic, social period of time that we are going through. There is also a quintessential American explanation for this, and that is the original sin of slavery and racism. And you have had, beginning with Barack Obama, I don't think there's any doubt about this, a reaction of white working class people to the loss of power and status. And Make America Great Again, with the emphasis on again, is a call to return to a power structure in which whites, predominantly white men, held most of the cards. And I think we have been in that mode of resentment, pushback ever since the election of the first African-American president. And the people who have become exquisitely skilled at exploiting that anger, that resentment, that sense of loss, have been able to sort of coalesce around not necessarily a set of policies or even coherent arguments, but the sense of grievance, of anger, of resentment. And I think that is, in many respects, racially based, and it's also religiously based. I think we have a group of evangelical Christians, or people who identify as evangelical Christians, who may not be religious at all, but look upon this as a existential threat to their view of America. And one of the most compelling statistics is the very large percentage of Republicans who think this is a white Christian country.
Yeah.
And it's, of course, neither a white Christian country by intention, and increasingly not by reality definition. Yeah. And that is, I think, part of this struggle that is going on. And, you know, I think we make a mistake in thinking that this is a static country. It is in constant motion before our eyes. And we are seeing now a millennial generation, a Gen Z generation that is becoming much more prominent in politics, that has a much greater share of the electorate. Mm-hmm. That is going to change politics as well. You see the rise of the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, that is people who do not identify with any religion whatsoever.
Right.
And that is going to change the nature of politics. So every time you think you figured America out, it's on the move. And I think sometimes the press forgets that and is looking backwards at the last election rather than forward.
Well, listen, I could go on talking with you and listening to you for the balance of the hour, but it would be unfair to people who've tuned in and who've submitted questions. So I'm going to, Jennifer, thank you. And I'm going to hand off to Suzanne Borden, who has the questions.
Great. Thank you both so much for that very interesting and important conversation. A few people have asked about, we talk about the Arizona governor's race and all of the other races where the Trump-backed candidate lost, but still a lot of people voted for them and they were so close and down to the wire. For instance, Arizona, 1.2 million people still voted for Lake, the Trump-backed candidate. And so what happens with, there's all these people out there who are still very much supporting some of these ideas that a lot of Republicans are trying to walk away from, and what happens with those?
Well, you know who got the most votes, with the exception of one person in American presidential history? Donald Trump. He just lost to the guy who actually got the most votes. So we have a very large segment of the American population that is very much attached to a tribal identity of Republican politics, of conservatism. But the question, I think, going forward is whether they realize that as a practical matter, if they want to hold power, if they want to return to power, that they cannot run these sorts of candidates and expect a general election constituency to embrace them. And I think when you kind of roll the history books back a bit, there was a period of time where Democrats again and again nominated very progressive presidential candidates and lost. And then they got tired of losing. And Bill Clinton and the Democratic leadership, faction came about, and they moderated, and they figured out, gosh, if we nominate moderates, we get, much more of our agenda. We get to hold power, and the Republicans don't get to take us in exactly the opposite direction. So I think we're going to see just how rational, how practical Republican voters are. And there's nothing like losing to sober you up. And losing is not fun. And having your hopes raised with huge expectations and having them dashed is very, very, I think, eye-opening for many Republicans. And I think you saw it in the reaction to Donald Trump's announcement, which was greeted at least with as much derision and misgivings as it was enthusiasm. That's not to say he's out of it or he no longer has a faction, but that the Republican Party, I think, is caught between these two views. Can we be more practical? Can we be more rational, more sellable in the general election? Or must we go down this road in order to really turn out and invigorate a minority, but a very strong minority of the American electorate?
Thank you. A few people, I'm going to combine a few questions going back to Gen Z and young people. They've grown up in a world of watching people disrespecting each other's views. If you don't like mine, you're wrong. They have not had the experience of watching people work across the aisle in Congress. So what kind of impact will that have in the future? And again, with the Gen Z coming out with record numbers in voting, how are both parties going to capitalize on that and try and engage them in future elections?
I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects of our politics right now, because we have been slaves to the baby boomers for most of my adult life in this giant generation that has dominated politics for better or for worse. And there is slowly a generational shift going on. And, I think there are a number of cultural phenomenon that are upstream from politics. This is a generation that is more diverse than ever before. They're more technologically competent than ever before. They are least religiously affiliated than any generation before. And they are also very used to a customized life. They choose what music is on their phones. They decide what work schedule they're going to be on. It is a customized, self-defined generation. And that really puts Republicans in a bind, I think, because if they're going to do a kind of authoritarian mindset, our way or the highway, a certain set of social, religious, cultural requirements, they're going to come up against a generation which doesn't really like being told what to do, what to think, and have their life plotted out for them. They are entrepreneurial in their life story and life creation. So I think Democrats here have an opportunity. On one hand, there's been great disillusionment for very good reason. These poor people have lived through pandemic. They've lived through multiple recessions. They lived through, some of them, the age is right, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. They've lived through January 6th. They've lived through 9/11. It has been one failure of elites and failure of government after another. This is the generation of college debt. This is the generation which feels that their economic opportunities are less than what their parents had. And so it's not a great advertisement for elites of any kind. But I do think that the Democrats, because they are a more heterogeneous party, have the ability to appreciate and to respect this very varied generation, which is very much insistent upon we'll have it our way, we'll define our own lives, and we'll make choices for ourselves. So I think this is going to be fascinating to see how the two parties respond to them. There are economic issues that are very real, very compelling, and there are these kind of general societal, cultural views that are, I think, as I said, upstream from politics, that really kind of shape people's views of society and their expectations of what government can and should do for them.
Mm-hmm. Can you comment on all of the redistricting that has taken place across the country and had a big impact in a lot of communities?
In terms of the congressional redistricting, project? One of the downsides, if you will, of redistricting, we learn a lot about America. I love the census years because you learn all these fascinating facts about America and you see how the country is shifting one way or the other. But unfortunately, we still largely are creatures of political gerrymandering. And we still then have relatively few, although it actually increased just a little bit this time in terms of competitive House seats, relatively few. And the number of incumbents who get reelected remains very, very high in Congress and in the Senate. You don't see a lot of incumbents who are losing. You have seen in a couple critical instances in which the power of African Americans was really about to be expanded by new district lines and pulled back. Some of these cases are still going on with the Supreme Court. So I think it is a function of this Democratic big question mark. How democratic are we going to be? How much do people feel like they have a stake in the system? How much does their vote matter? If politicians are able to choose the voters rather than the other way around, there's a lack of accountability, there's a lack of responsiveness. And I think you see as a result of that, there's a fair amount of experimentation going on, which I think is terrific. One of the things we haven't talked about is the success and the I think expansion we're going to see of ranked choice voting, which is one way of responding to this deep tribalism that has developed. And that is if you force people to, because you're listing a first, second, third, fourth, and sometimes fifth choice, you're forcing candidates to appeal to more than one small section of the party. We are saying that we're not going to choose the vast majority of our congressional candidates in very lightly attended political primaries during the middle of the summer. And I think it passed in Alaska, it passed this time in Nevada, and I think you're going to see it come up on the ballot in many more places. And I think that is one way of trying to make the political environment less toxic, more dynamic, and to try to make the political class more responsive to voters. So I think that's one of the most fascinating developments. I did not think it had a chance because both parties have every reason in the world not to do it because they want to turn out their, hardcore people. They don't want the breakdown of the parties, but lo and behold, the voters get a say. And I think they're becoming more comfortable with this and realizing, hey, it makes a difference in the kind of candidate we wind up getting.
Can I just add that would you agree though that the idea that it's only Republicans who are drawing gerrymandered maps doesn't give enough credit to the Illinois legislature that I think added a district for the Democrats. I think California wrote the New York legislature wrote drew a map that was so egregiously designed to elect more Democrats that it was thrown out by the court. So this is, I thought you described the problem very well, but we shouldn't think that it's only something that Republicans
Absolutely.
are doing.
And when the Supreme Court decided that they weren't going to wade into gerrymandering, aside from racial gerrymandering, they had one case that the Democrats had badly gerrymandered and one case in which the Republicans had. So it is absolutely a problem of both sides. And this just reinforces this tribalism, this unwillingness to compromise, this sense that they don't have to be responsive to the center of the political spectrum, only to their camp. And I think one of the disappointments that I had in the failure of voting reform, which I think was disappointing on many levels, is the fact that we are still in this gerrymandered system, which makes for atrophy and really some very brittle politics.
Thank you. As we wrap up, I'm sorry we can't get to more questions, but as your closing thoughts, the state of our democracy, is there a reason to be hopeful, dreadful? Where do we stand?
I kind of feel like we have been granted a reprieve. We get democracy for a couple more years. The people who ran on a very authoritarian message, an election denying message, really lost overwhelmingly. And that was very comforting. But as you pointed out, a great many people still voted for these folks, and they're not going anywhere. The so-called alternatives to Trump, in many instances, have very authoritarian tendencies. And I would point to Governor DeSantis. In fact, just recently, one of his sort of assaults on the First Amendment was struck down. You still have a faction of American politics that would prefer to have it their way rather than have true democracy. And I think it's going to take everyone. It's going to take politicians. It's going to take civil society. It's going to take business leaders. It's going to take everyone to ensure that basic principles of fairness, of the rule of law, of civil liberties prevail. Ronald Reagan was right in one big way in which he said that we're only a generation away from losing our freedom. And I think for many, many years, most of us thought, oh, well, yeah, that's, Ronald Reagan. I think we have now come to appreciate how fragile democracy is and how critical it is that we all remain engaged, that we vote, and that we not simply turn up at election time, that we remain engaged in the issues that motivate us, and the causes that we care about, and that we think a lot harder about educating people, both adults and children, about democracy, about civics, about the democratic legacy that they have. So I would not want us to let down our guard, but I do breathe a sigh of relief after these midterms. And the question, which is in every generation, is we got a republic if we can keep it. And so it'll be up to Americans, all 350 million of our fractious fellow Americans, to figure out whether that democracy is worth defending.
Great. Thank you both, Jennifer Rubin and Robert Siegel, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with our audience. I want to let everybody, thank you. I want to let everybody know that we'll be sending out an email with a link to this recording, along with the links to our gala this Sunday, which we invite everybody to join us. Please use the link to get your complimentary ticket. Again, go to our website, momentmag.com, where you can sign up for our next program, which is the week after Thanksgiving, with filmmaker Ken Burns. He'll be talking about his latest documentary on the Holocaust, along with a new book about portraits of America. Again, thank you both, and we will see everybody next time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Jennifer.